One thing I know when we are children, if you've had children, I have one, a lot of you have children, grandkids. Even if you haven't had children personally, you know this is the case. Children ask why all the time, right? You say, don't touch the stove. What do they say? Why? Or you say, be in tonight by 9 o'clock. What do they say? Why? So they're always asking questions. Kids always ask questions. But here's the thing. A lot of times when we ask a question, there's actually a question behind the question. For example, there's a book John Miller wrote recently called The Question Behind the Question. And he says there's two kinds of questions. There's the IQ question, which he calls the incorrect question. And then he says there's the QBQ, which is the question behind the question. And he says a lot of times the problem is we are asking the incorrect questions. For example, a lot of times we'll say things like, why is this happening to me? Or we'll ask the question, why don't I ever get a break? And he says that's a common question that people ask. Why is this happening to me? Why don't I ever get a break? But John Miller argues that that's the incorrect question, because that kind of question, what's happening to me, is really a victimhood statement, okay? In other words, I don't have any control. I don't understand. Why is this happening to me? That's a victimhood question. It's an entitlement thinking. Why don't I ever get a break? Like I'm entitled to get a break. He said those are the wrong kinds of questions. He argues in his book that the true question behind that question should be, how can I solve my problems today? In other words, instead of using the incorrect question of why is this happening to me, the question behind the question should be, how can I solve my problem today? Or how can I move forward today? That really is the question behind the question. And right now we are in just an unprecedented time. It's weird for me to think that, Lord willing, a month from now, we'll be meeting together at Warren. Wow. And just being at home. I personally haven't left the house since last Monday. And I sent my wife out on Friday. No, she really wanted to go out. Now, we've walked the neighborhood several times. Probably take a nice walk today. I set up my hammock in the backyard. I'm planning, if it's nice and sunny, I'm going to go out and lay and read in the hammock today. It's one of my favorite Sunday afternoon things to do. But I haven't gotten in my car and driven out of the house since last Monday, which is really weird because I tend to be on the road a lot. So it's really kind of weird to be in this situation. And so it's a time of a lot of questions. And so people are asking, from a theological standpoint, why is God allowing COVID-19? Or how can God be a God of love and allow things like this to happen? Or where is God in the midst of this? And this might be a question that somebody whose family member or themselves personally is struggling with it. Where are you, God, in the midst of this? And all those are valid questions. I'm not saying they're invalid questions. They're not questions that shouldn't be asked, because they're questions that should be asked. But is it possible that when we ask, why is God allowing COVID-19, there's really a deeper question behind the question? And that oftentimes the people that are asking that question don't really want to ask the question behind that question. In other words, a lot of times those kinds of questions, not always, but a lot of times those kinds of questions come from people who are very skeptical about God or want to deny the existence of God. So they throw questions out like that at Christians, and they say, where is God? But maybe the reason they ask that question is because there's really a question behind that question that they don't want to grapple with. In other words, if there is a God, what's the implication for my life? What if there is a God? And a lot of times people will throw out top questions like, why is God allowing COVID-19? Again, not always. But a lot of times they'll throw out those top questions as kind of barbs because they don't really want to go below the surface and answer the true question behind the question. And the question is, why are we afraid to answer the question behind the question? Now, in this passage of scripture we're going to look at today, Jesus asks the most powerful man in the city a question, and he does it to get to the question that's really behind the question. So John chapter 21, this today is called Palm Sunday, which is the beginning of the last week of Jesus' life. It's this week that the Gospels slow down. I mean, like whole chapters in the Gospels are devoted to like a single hour or two or a day. I mean, they just slow way down. I mean, John is 21 chapters long, and basically chapters 13 through 20 are just the last week of Jesus' life, okay? The first 14 chapters are the first 2.5 years, 3 years or so of Jesus' life. So the Gospels really slow down. Of course, we call this Palm Sunday because this is the day when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the donkey. The people are throwing the palm branches. They're shouting, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And it's really freaking out the religious leaders, okay? Because they're thinking, this is ripe for a revolt, okay? This is not good. These people are forming in behind this man, and this man who does these miracles. We're not sure how he does it, but you know, and they're glomming onto this guy, and this is not going to be good. And you have to understand that the Jews had a history of revolt. They were under the Roman rule, and they revolted many times in their past. There were revolts and uprisings led against the Roman government. And the last thing the religious leaders wanted was a revolt. They didn't want a revolt on their hands. At this point, the religious leaders, they didn't have full power, but they had a pretty good amount of power over the Jewish people and as far as their religion and all that stuff. And they didn't want to upset Rome. They wanted to just kind of keep everybody happy. So Jesus comes in on Sunday, then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, he's kind of in and out of Jerusalem, teaching in the temple and things like that. The religious leaders are getting really riled up about Jesus. They're really getting mad about Jesus. They're like, we got to get rid of this guy. Judas sets up this plot with him. They're deciding they're going to put this plot into motion. And so Thursday comes, it's Passover. You probably know the story. We call this Maundy Thursday now. This is when Jesus got with his disciples. They celebrated Passover. Then after they had the Passover, of course, Judas left to go betray Jesus. After they finish the Passover, they go out to the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus prays. And then late into the night, the guards show up, and Judas betrays Jesus and kisses him on the cheek, says, "This is he." They arrest him. The disciples flee. They take Jesus to Caiaphas, the high priest, and they start interrogating him all throughout the night. And Jesus has been now interrogated all night, and that's where what we're going to look at today. And what we're going to look at today is the last question that Jesus asked before he went to the cross. This is the last question that Jesus is asking here with somebody before he goes to the cross. And it happens on early Friday morning. It is, again, just imagine the scenario. You got a bloodied, beaten up, weary Jesus standing before the most powerful man in the area, the governor. And Jesus is going to ask this powerful man a question. So let's take a look at it. And we'll flip over here to John chapter 21 and take a look at this question here this morning as we get into this. So John chapter 21. So here it is. They took Jesus from Caiaphas, that's the high priest, to the governor's headquarters. It was early in the morning. Okay, now the Jews typically would, the Romans would typically start their meeting time in the morning, sometimes around as early as 6 o'clock in the morning. So they are, this is maybe about 6 o'clock in the morning there, and so Jesus has been up all night, they've been up all night, and they take Jesus into Caiaphas, And here's what it says. They did not enter into the headquarters themselves. And again, otherwise they would be defiled, not able to eat the Passover. So the Jewish leaders did not want to go into the Passover, into Pilate's area, because again, he was a Gentile, he was unclean, and they really wanted to make sure that they were able to observe the Passover. So this is what we now call Good Friday. This is very early on Good Friday, probably about 6 or 7 in the morning. And so this is where our story is continuing on. So let's take a look at it. Then Pilate came out to meet them, of course, because they wouldn't go in to see him, and said, "What charge do you bring against this man?" So here they got Jesus in front of him. He's bloodied. He's looking bad. And they answered him, "If this man weren't a criminal, we wouldn't have handed him over to you." So right there, they just kind of blow him off. They're like, "Look, Pilate, just if he wasn't a criminal, we wouldn't bring him out here, okay? Let's not talk about this." Because really, their beef with Jesus was theological. Jesus was claiming to be the Son of God, and they were like, "You can't be the Son of God. You're an illegitimate child. Your father was a carpenter. You're from Nazareth. You're not leading an army. You're not this political king. You are just a deranged, delusional lunatic. But unfortunately, all these people are getting in line behind you. We've just seen this huge processional, and so we are not, so Pilate, you don't care about this stuff. Don't worry about it. Just leave it alone, Pilate." So that's really what they're kind of saying. And so Luke fills in the gap, because they realize that Pilate is not going to really accept this. And so Luke fills in the gap here that John doesn't talk about here. And again, it's not a conflict. Luke's just filling in a couple holes here, and because he's writing with a different idea behind him. And we'll take a look at that in just a second. So Pilate, he's like, "Take him for yourselves and judge him according to your law." So Pilate's kind of like, "Okay, I get this. This is just theological." And they say, "No, it's not illegal. It's not legal for us to put anyone to death." The Jews did declare. They said this so that Jesus' words might be fulfilled, signifying what kind of death he would die. So again, Jesus said, "I'm going to be crucified. I'm going to be lifted up." He said that, and when I am lifted up, which that is crucifixion, right? That's what they did. They lifted people up on the cross. "I will draw all people to myself." So Jesus predicted this is how he would die, that he would be crucified. And so, believe it or not, they're just falling right in line with what Jesus said would happen. Okay? So again, like I said, Luke fills this in here. He fills in the gap here. And here, so they realize that Pilate's probably not going to do anything. So they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man subverting our nation." Now, what they're trying to do is to get Pilate's attention. They're trying to get Pilate to do something, because they realize Pilate could care less if this is a theological issue. And when Jesus was a little boy, around AD 6, there was a Jewish tax revolt. There was a revolt by the Jews against the Romans because of their heavy taxation. And that revolt had to be put down. So when they say, "We found this man subverting our nation," that gets Pilate's attention. Because the last thing that Pilate wants is to have people who are leading a revolt. He doesn't want a revolt on his hands. So then they moved from that, and they just added on even thicker. They said, "We found this man subverting our nation." Now they're going to throw it even on thicker. "Opposing payment of taxes to Caesar." Again, this is a bold lie, because Jesus said earlier, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and render unto God what is God's." Jesus never said, "Don't pay your taxes." Okay? He said, the government obviously has a function. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 13, and you need to render taxes unto them what they have, and then you also render unto God what is God. So now they have moved from just kind of a lie to even a bigger lie. And then, just to make sure they get a really icing on the cake, they say, "And saying that he himself is the Messiah." a king. Whoa, only Caesar was the king. Okay. So they knew they couldn't get anywhere with Pilate regarding a theological dispute. Pilate could care less. Pilate was he was a pagan. He didn't believe. He worshiped many gods like the Romans would. And so he didn't buy into the Jewish God of being only one God. And so Pilate's like, I don't care what you guys do. And so they're like, okay, he's not going to do anything. So let's just really make this a political thing so that hopefully we can get Pilate to act. So Pilate realizes, okay, I need to address this. I can't let this go. And so look at what happens next in the passage here. So then Pilate went back into the headquarters. Of course, the Jewish leaders would not go in there. And he summoned Jesus. So Jesus walks in. Obviously, he's bloodied and beaten and extremely tired. And he said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, this is Pilate's opening question to Jesus. All right. He's like, hey, you just tell me this. Are you the king of the Jews? Now, I think Pilate probably said that somewhat sarcastically because there's no army that's marching in on Jerusalem. And Jesus doesn't look much like a king at this point because he's been beaten up by all people, by the religious people. So it's not like he's been at war. And so I think Pilate's somewhat sarcastic. Now, Jesus, you would expect Jesus to do one or two things. First of all, to just not say anything. Because most of the night when he was being interrogated by the religious leaders, he never said much. He kept his mouth shut most of the time, which was astonishing to them and extremely angry to them. And when Jesus did speak, he basically was saying, I am the Son of God. You're going to see me coming on the clouds. And they were like, no. And again, he did that. His mission was to go to the cross. And so he knew that would really get them angry. Of course, he was telling them the truth, but they didn't want to hear the truth. And so when he goes before Pilate, you would expect he would be what he had been like most of the night, just kept his mouth shut. Or he could have just said, no, I've never proclaimed myself to be the king of the Jews per se. And he never did call himself the king of the Jews. When he asked the disciples earlier, who do you say that I am? Peter said, you are the Son of God. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he said, you've spoken correctly. But Jesus refrained from going around calling himself the king because he knew that the Jews were, of course, looking for the Messiah, but the way they understood the Old Testament scriptures, that the Messiah would be a political leader, not this idea of a lamb who would be slain for the sins of the world. So Jesus didn't use kingly language to refer to himself at this point because he wasn't looking to be the political leader. He had a more important task, which was to deliver people from their sin. And so he could have just kept his mouth shut, or he could have just said, no, I never called myself the king of the Jews. But instead, what Jesus does is really interesting. He answers Pilate's question with a question. Take a look at this because it's really interesting what he does. He answers Pilate's question and he answers it with a question. So take a look at this in the text here this morning, what he does. Jesus answered, "Are you asking this on your own, or have others told you about me?" Are you asking this on your own, or have others told you about me? Now, when you read that question, you're like, what kind of question is that? I mean, why are you asking a question in response to Pilate's question? And what Jesus is doing here is he he has moved from being the one who's being interrogated to the interrogator, and he's asking Pilate a question, and what he's trying to do is to get behind the question. What is the question behind the question? In other words, what Jesus is, the question behind Pilate's question is this: are you, Pilate, interested in really knowing who I am? Or are you just interested in what people say about me? Okay. Are you really interested, you personally? Or are you just interested in what people say? Now, this is a probing question, and it's a question that every one of us has to address. Are you really seeking truth? Do you really want to know who Jesus is? Or are you just, whatever people say, I'll just hook, line, and sinker? It's a question. Do you really want to know Jesus? Do you really want to know what it's like to have a relationship? Do you want to do that? Or you just want to kind of go on what other people are saying? And it's a question all of us have to address. It's the question that's really behind the question. You see, a lot of times, people will say, well, prove to me there is a God, or you can't prove to me there is a God, or how can you prove to me there's a God? But there's a question really behind their question that you need to ask. If there is a God, what would be the implication for your life? What would be the implication for how you live your life? What would you do about it if there is a God? Now, here's what Pilate does, and he does what a lot of people do. Pilate's like, wait, I'm not going there. I'm not going to address that question. In fact, I'm just going to try and slam another question at Jesus because I don't want to talk about this. So Pilate comes back, and his response is to Jesus, he's like, I am not a Jew, am I? I mean, it's just like a wall. Pilate just puts the wall up there. He doesn't want to talk to this. He's like, basically saying, don't ask me a question here. I'm not the one here on the hot seat. And then Pilate goes on and he says, your own nation and chief priests handed you over to me. I mean, Pilate's like trying to dig in a little bit on Jesus. Like, look, even your own people don't want to have anything. Your own religious leaders, at least, don't want to have anything to do with you. So, I mean, come on, Jesus. I'm not here to answer your question. I don't want to talk about your question. I'm not interested in your question. I want to be the interrogator. I don't want to deal with my own heart. And so Pilate comes back with another question. What have you done? Now, honestly, that really should have been Pilate's first question. Like, what have you done to tick these people off? But that wasn't his first question. Now, Jesus comes back, this time not with another question, because clearly Pilate has a wall. Pilate doesn't want to let Jesus into his heart. He doesn't want to let Jesus to probe into his heart. He just blows Jesus off. He tries to get a jab in at Jesus. He tries to direct it to a different direction here. And so Jesus goes back, and instead of asking Pilate another question, he answers his question. Okay, and here's what he says. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. As it is, my kingdom does not have its own origin here. And so Jesus says, okay, here's the deal, Pilate. Yeah, I'm a king, but not of this world. My kingdom's of a different place. And you can see the evidence for that, Pilate, because you don't see any of my followers out here with swords. Nobody's trying to fight. There's no army coming in. Pilate, this is a theological issue because I'm talking to you in theological terms. And Jesus says some words that you have to think Pilate was just kind of like, what? Because Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. And he goes on and he says something that I think really kind of gets Pilate like going like, what are you talking about, Jesus? I mean, what is going on here? So take a look at the next thing that Jesus says here in the next verse. I think he really kind of mystifies Pilate. He says, "You are a king then?" Pilate asked. And Jesus said, "You say that I'm a king. I was born for this." What do you mean born for this, Jesus? I mean, are you saying you were born to like be handed over by the Jews and to be crucified? That's not really a king answer, right? I mean, a king answer would be, I was born to fight and to set up my kingdom. And you're saying I was born for this? That doesn't make sense. And then Jesus says something else that truly had to mystify Pilate. He says, "And I have come into the world for this, to testify to the truth. And everyone who is of the truth listens to me." And so again, I would imagine Pilate was like, wait a minute. You came here to testify to the truth? And again, Jesus is making statements that is opening up Pilate for the opportunity to really go into himself and to ask some questions. But instead, Pilate just blows it off. And here's what he says in the last verse. Pilate just says, and he just says this sarcastically, "What is truth? What is truth?" In other words, Jesus, I mean, let's just not, I don't want to deal with this. I don't really want to deal with this. You see, the questions behind the question that Pilate was afraid to ask is, can you tell me the truth about myself? See, Pilate didn't want to ask that. He's like, oh, what is truth? He didn't want to ask the question behind his question. Can you, Jesus, tell me the truth about myself? Can you tell me the truth about this kingdom, the Roman kingdom over which I have a part in ruling? Can you, Jesus, can you tell me what's really going on here? This whole, because my wife came to me, because we know this, Pilate's wife came to him earlier and said, have nothing to do with this man. So Pilate could have said, Jesus, my wife came to me and said, had nothing to do with you. She had a dream. There's something more going on here than what's going on here. Can you tell me more what is going on here? And I got a feeling that Pilate's gut, his own gut reaction, his visceral reaction is, I need to know more, but he has this wall in his heart. Nope, not interested. You're not going to be interrogating me, Jesus. I don't want to answer the question behind the question. And that's really my question to you today. And you may be watching this broadcast, and I know we're not on Facebook Live. We will be hopefully shortly. But even as a member or part of the family at Warren Baptist Church, you're watching this. When you throw out questions, what is the question that's really behind the question? In other words, where is God in the midst of COVID-19? Maybe the question behind the question is, am I really trusting God? Let's say you get sick with COVID-19 and you're like, where is God? How can you let this happen to me, God? Maybe the real question behind that question is, am I trusting him? Maybe you're somebody who's watching today and you're skeptical about God, and whenever theology comes up, talk about God, you throw out questions like, well, if there was a God, why about this? And if there is this, and why does God allow this? And why does God allow that? And those are all legitimate questions, but is it possible that the reason you respond to people when they talk about God and when they start probing, the reason you throw out those questions is because there's really a question behind your question that you don't want to answer? I mean, again, I read atheist things. I'm getting ready to launch Ask Pastor Jim. More about that this week. And one of my questions to people is, are you a seeker of truth? I mean, feel free to ask all the questions you want, but are you seeking the truth? And that's what Jesus was really asking Pilate in his question. Do you really want to know who I am, Pilate? Or you just want to go with what they say about me? Is this a personal question, or is this just a question you throw out there because you're just trying to figure out what to do here? And that's for you and I in life when we go through struggles. And look, we all do. We all have moments of struggle. Even Christ followers who've been following Jesus for 50, 60 years. I know a lot of our saints in church, and of course I'm getting older too, can tell you, I mean, I've known the Lord for 40 years. And I plus 40 plus years. And I've had struggles. We all do. It's part of life. And we all have questions. There are questions this morning, even in my quiet time this morning. I was reading two passages of scripture juxtaposed against each other, and I have a question. Okay, and that's fine. Questions are normal. I get that. But when we ask questions, we also need to stop and ask ourselves, is there really a question behind the question I'm asking that I'm not wanting to answer? And that's only you can answer that. When you have questions about God, and those are fine, I want you to stop though first and say, what's the question behind this question? In other words, how can you prove there's a God? Is the question behind the question, would I be willing? What would be the implications if there is a God? You need to ask that question of yourself as well. So this morning on Palm Sunday, as Jesus rode into Jerusalem, proclaimed, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." By Friday of this week, he was on a cross, and by Friday night, Friday afternoon, late afternoon, he was dead. And then next Sunday, when we gather, we celebrate the resurrection. Jesus proved that he is the way and the truth and the life. When Pilate said, "What is truth?" he asked that question of the very truth that was standing in front of him. And by Sunday, when Jesus resurrected from the dead, he proved that everything he said was indeed true. And you have to grasp that. You and I have to grapple with that. Do we believe or not? And if you're a person who's struggling with faith and struggling with belief, why? Why? Be willing to ask the question behind the question. Let's pray. Father, this morning, I know we have our folks here from Warren, and we're in our private room here. It's not exactly the way I wanted this morning to go, but maybe this is the way it needed to go. And Father, there may be somebody here is watching with a friend or family member of Warren who has a lot of questions. And I want to challenge him this morning to ask the question behind the question. What are the implications? What are the implications of the fact that Jesus rose from the dead? What does that mean in their life? What would it mean if they give their heart and life to you? What would it mean if we trust you fully during these times of crisis? What would that look like? How does that work in our lives?